and some trials and tribulations too.
Yeah, one of the things, Kate, that I'm really interested in is like kind of so like against that backdrop, what does it mean to be in charge of people's sort of professional development and learning? But before we go
Yeah.
there just a little bit, I've heard the term blitz scaling and sort of hyper growth. I don't know whether they're interchangeable terms, but I know there's a great podcast on the company that's probably worth people listening to. Can you explain those terms?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think hypergrowth is sort of self-explanatory, right? Like companies often grow if they're lucky. And when I got here, it was very clear that we weren't just growing, we were in hypergrowth. And that hypergrowth was a thing that was happening for a number of companies around us. Reid Hoffman was really interested in understanding, and Reid, by the way, is the founder and was formerly the CEO of LinkedIn, is now a founding partner of Greylock, which is an investment firm. He's also on our board. And he recently published a book called Blitzscaling. He also has a podcast that unpacks this. And that podcast was really, and the book, frankly, were both the output of a course that he ran on this topic at Stanford. And what Reid was really interested in knowing is, what is it about Silicon Valley companies that is frankly unique? Like what was this experience? What do these things hold? What do these companies hold in common such that we could sort of shed light on a different way of growing an organization? And the way that he describes it is this idea that blitzscaling is a framework and a set of techniques that allow companies to achieve massive scale at incredible speed, so much so that they're willing to optimize for speed over efficiency. So it's not about saving costs. It's not about us becoming as efficient as possible at the front end. It's actually about growing lightning fast, knowing that there's going to be a lot of mess and redundancy along the way.
Interesting. And so we're going to come back. We're going to come back to this, but you move into this hyper growth environment, and as I said before we started our conversation in the sort of preamble, I told the story of your career and your work at Apple and Lucasfilm. Did they prepare you? Did that work prepare you for this in any way? What was that journey like?
Yeah, I think it did, insofar as the one thing that well, there's a few things that these companies had in common. First of all, I wasn't at Apple in the days of Steve Jobs, but I was there shortly after. And there's no question that the shadow of Steve loomed large. I was at Lucasfilm, which of course had been founded by George Lucas. And now I'm at Airbnb, having been founded by two designers and a technologist. And the sort of, besides being very much founder driven, all of these organizations were built, frankly, by creatives who had a really strong passion for technology. And so art, design, and technology have been really at the forefront of my career, ever since I really entered the world of work. And I think that there are some special circumstances that occur in companies like this. There's no question that Lucasfilm required extraordinary technology to create the world of Star Wars, and specifically the films and the visual effects that, frankly, I was much more involved in than the actual film production. So my job was to work with technologists and creatives every day who were working on primarily visual effects and then animation for films and television. And so that was a mix that I found really powerful, because you took the best of creatives, the best of technology, and you put it all together to incredible effect in a way that really served storytelling and wowed audiences around the world, right? You look at Apple and it's not dissimilar. It's the combination of design and technology and putting products in people's hands that they never thought, they never could have conceived of their own. And then similarly, Airbnb is very much led by a designer at heart, but who understands how you bring technology to bear against really massive design problems. So how do you solve for trust through really great design? How do you solve for an experience that builds belonging and humanity through really, really great design? Those, I think, are the ways in which those are the ways in which those companies hold something.
So design
I
is a
think
common
very
thread,
much
whether
in
it's
common.
the experience or the device or the exquisite sort of visual universe that's created. I can imagine
Yeah,
that attention to detail and focus on, perhaps that I associate with Apple, and I'm sure Lucasfilms is sort of like crazy attention to
yeah,
fidelity and detail. How does that work in the blitzscaling world?
yeah, yeah. It's a really good question. I think um, it's interesting because when you're prioritizing speed over efficiency, I think in some respect you're also prioritizing speed over, in some respects, attention to detail. In some respects, yes, in some respects, no. So what that meant is that, so one of the things Brian talks about in his interview with Reed on the Blitzscaling podcast is this idea that, he really wanted to imagine, what if you host an experience and you take it all the way to 11, right? You sort of, and then you back down from there, like 11 experiences, you're going to take a guest to the moon, and you're going to host them there, and it's going to be a beach party on the moon or what have you. And you sort of back off of that to, what would be, what would be something you could actually accomplish in reality, but would still be magical. Um, so what that meant is that long term, I think this company has had, and frankly, Brian, our CEO, has always had this incredible eye on the prize. I mean, there is this way in which Airbnb is intent on delivering an end-to-end magical trip that I think it has a very much in laser focus. And in getting there, we have made choices to scale as quickly as possible, that so we can now start to back in and figure out what are those all those little levels of detail that in the trip that we can actually somehow make better. So while I think there was strong emphasis over gaining a global network effect, for example, in the early days, which really meant going out and acquiring as much supply as we possibly could and enabling as many travelers as we possibly could, now it's a question of how do we make that experience as quality and as magical as we possibly can make it. Not just for homestays, but also for experiences and transportation and any other aspect of the trip that we think has opportunity
So let's
to
kind of
improve.
focus on that a little bit. You talked about trust as an important sort of component of the work that goes on there. How would you describe the culture of the company?
Yeah.
And for example, the mission statement and the just the raison d'etre of the company
Yeah.
from a sort of cultural point of view?
Yeah. So the mission of the company is to enable anyone to belong anywhere. And inherent in that is this notion that, and frankly, a belief system that most people are good, that most of the people on the planet are good, and that they, given the opportunity, are going to do right by another human. And so I think what the platform is ultimately trying to enable is the real, true, offline, real world connection of strangers, humans to humans, building greater understanding, building a sense of belonging, so that no matter where you go in the world, you're going to be able to find through Airbnb a community, a friend, someone who's going to make you feel like you can belong there. What that means is that that's essentially what we're designing for. That's what we're trying to create. It's a pretty idealistic notion, right? But it's also, we're finding something that people are very much interested in helping build, because people are, we think, getting lonelier. As the more that we interact with each other exclusively in an online way, the more we're seeing that there's an uptick in depression and loneliness, right? So this is really all about, how do we get back into the real world, and how do we enable connections through an online platform among people in the offline world? That requires a tremendous amount of trust, right? It just requires a tremendous amount of trust.
It's really extraordinary. I think the mission you're on, it's not always sort of writ large, and I have to assume that part of the sort of amazing growth that's come in the company is because you've hit some kind of a nerve there, and some desire to belong,
Yeah,
and desire to connect,
yeah,
in a broader way. And it seems it's so different from a lot of the sort of current thinking and gnashing of teeth around how these social platforms are sort of spreading evil in the world as well as good.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that it's one of the things that really fuels people here is um, knowing that we are, at least through our digital technologies, in many respects becoming increasingly entrenched.
Yeah.
How do we unentrench, right? How do we actually get out in the real world and interact with people who might be really different from us, um, but who are willing to open their homes to us? Yeah, no, it's really
Yeah,
inspiring.
amazing mission. It makes me think of your sort of Russian experience in high school, and it all sort of comes full circle on that one.
Absolutely.
Let's one more thing on the sort of landscape here, and then we'll dive into the learning piece a little bit. But what about, we talked about culture. You have a kind of what's the demographic
Yeah.
look like there, and what sort of, how does that set up conditions for the work that you do?
Yeah. So the company skews pretty young. And it's actually, frankly, one of the reasons why I came here. I'd come from organizations where there were a lot of what I called silverbacks, right? Like people who had been at that company for a long time, knew each other really deeply, knew the product or the company really deeply, had been doing what they've been doing for 30, 40 years. People who were sort of household names or at least professional industry
Yeah.
names that everybody knew, right? Um, and this was going to be totally different. This was going to be walking into an organization that was full of 20-year-olds, maybe a few 30-year-olds, where I was now going to be one of the very few with gray hair. And I was frankly drawn to this place because of the future of work, because I was really interested in understanding if I'm interested in creating a new future, what is the next generation behind me creating? And how do I get to be a part of that? How do I get to experience? How do I understand how it might be different? And I think, frankly, when I tap into, I hate the term millennials because I sort of feel like so many of these constructs aren't particularly useful. But what I often see in this population of people is, frankly, that they want all the same things that I've always been wanting, or that I always thought that the world of work could deliver on. That they don't think is a nice to have; they think is a must have. So there's and you combine that with the mission of the company, and I think it combines to equal a lot of people who are very young, super smart, super talented, are super into what we're doing, um, and are themselves hosts, right? Like we put a lot of stock in our core
Mm.
values. One of our values is to be a host. And so you walk into Airbnb and everyone around you is falling all over themselves to welcome you and to open the door for you, or to pick something that you might have dropped on the ground. It's a very lovely and in many respects
And
homey kind
how well
of
do you think
environment.
those people, those young people, the demographic, are prepared for this kind of workplace as they come presumably from colleges and graduate programs?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really great question. I think what happens is that people arrive with tremendous talents and increasingly, frankly, as we scale, even more experience than what we've typically seen. So I am seeing sort of a migration into the company of more experienced people because, frankly, our business is so complex at this point that people need more scaffolding than what college will provide you in order to navigate what it is we now need to navigate. But I think what I'm witnessing is that there are ways in which we're moving very quickly, in which our work is incredibly uncertain. It's full of ambiguities. Our work is exceedingly complex. And what people need to quickly see is that it is in the commingling of all of those sets of expertise that the magic really happens. This is the way in which I think
Mm.
universities are striving to make a change, meaning you see the creation of more and more interdisciplinary
Hmm.
programs that better map to the way that people work. And yet, when you look at most companies, they're still going out and hiring for a certain set of expertise. And it's still incumbent upon colleges to help those people build that expertise that will get them in the door in the first place. What that means then is that our job oftentimes is to continue that learning, but throwing all of them into the mix and helping them see, well, if I'm an engineer, I can learn this from a designer. Or if I'm a designer, this is how engineers actually think, because they don't get that exposure necessarily in their educational experiences. But boy, did they quickly get it here.
I just was at USC at the Center for Convergent Biosciences on the USC campus in LA, and they're doing extraordinary experiments there with what they call convergent working. And it's not collaboration, it's a little bit different, but you have two sets of people with very, very different deep expertise. In this case, one is